Good evening. Welcome to the China Forum. I'm Carrie Dumbaugh. I work as an analyst in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service. Our guest this evening is a very special one. We will be meeting with Ambassador Arthur Hummel, who is sitting right here with me. He will be our only guest. Ambassador Hummel has had a distinguished career in the Foreign Service of the United States. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, and in addition to that, held 4 ambassadorships to Ethiopia, Burma, Pakistan, and, for our purposes, important, the People's Republic of China. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador, to the China Forum. You were born in China. You worked as ambassador in China from 1981 to 1985, but actually you were born there, and you spent a good deal of your early life there. Is that correct?
Yes. Actually, I was 8 years old when my parents moved. We moved to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
My father had been a congregational missionary, teaching in schools, and he became a China scholar and was invited to join the Library of Congress, where you work.
That's where I work.
And was in charge of what they called the Oriental Division at that time for many years until he retired.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've heard stories that you had quite a colorful past in China. You were in China during the war and were interned by the Japanese, isn't that right?
Yes.
For 3.5 years. And then you escaped and fought with Chinese guerrillas against the Japanese in Shandong province. Start back with your internment and tell us some of those stories. Tell us what happened.
Well, if you don't mind, let me start a little farther back. I was in China, having been a college dropout in the States. Great trauma in days when dropping out of college was not fashionable. And drifted out to the United States, to China on my own, more or less, in 1940, and was studying the language and teaching English, and was too dumb to leave before Pearl Harbor. This was all in Peking, and Peking had been occupied since 1937 by the Japanese. This was part of occupied China, and the war was going on. The Sino-Japanese war was already on. So on Pearl Harbor Day, the Japanese decided that we were all enemy aliens, which we were. War had been declared, and we Americans were enemies, along with Canadians and British and a lot of other people. And
this was on Pearl Harbor Day, is that? Or
yes, on Pearl Harbor Day, which was December 7th, our time in China, December 8th here. And they rounded us up in various ways, eventually sent us off, all of us, must have been about 2,500 of us, in a camp down in Shandong province. Shandong province is the province that sticks out sort of toward Korea, way out to the east end. The camp, as I said, had about 2,500 people in it. It was a civilian internee camp and was not nearly as horrible as POW camps were.
Really?
Anyway, a British friend of mine and I tried for quite a long time, and took us a long time to make contact with somebody outside the camp so that when we jumped over the wall and escaped, we would be taken care of and not turned back to the Japanese.
How do you do this, though? I mean, you're inside this camp. How does one try to, I think of Hogan's Heroes or some television program. How was that done? You knew of someone out there?
No, we were sending blind letters out.
I see.
My friend had worked for the British American Tobacco Company. He's British. He still is living, lives in Bombay. And he had some Chinese contacts, and he would ask the Chinese workers, coolies, who worked in the camp and went in and out under Japanese supervision, he would ask them to smuggle letters out. And eventually we got a response from this Chinese nationalist guerrilla unit, and set a date, and then we got permission from the camp authorities, that is the organization of the Americans and British inside the camp. We got a permission from them to depart. It was really rather easy getting out.
I mean, you had to have permission to escape from the...
Well, we wanted to get permission, yes, because there would quite likely be repercussions on the camp. The people we got a hold of had offered a wild scheme by letter to come and liberate the camp and build an airfield nearby and wait for airplanes to come and lift all the internees out and safely home back to West China, free China. That was obviously not practical. But the idea of having two people in place outside the camp with friendly troops nearby, just in case something would happen, who knows, maybe the Japanese would start massacring internees, which of course they never did. Anyway, it was attractive to the camp authorities to have the two of us there in place. And we managed to supply a lot of information through couriers to the camp.
Oh, to the camp, once you were out on the outside?
After we were out, yes.
So you said you escaped over the wall. You just jumped over this wall?
Well, it was ridiculously easy. The Japanese, we were the only two to escape. After we escaped, the Japanese dug huge trenches and made it much more difficult to leave. But at that time, all you needed was 2 step ladders and some friendly helpers of British and Americans in the camp. Stand on 1 step ladder and jump over the 8-foot, 10-foot, 9 or 10-foot wall. Get a step ladder over and then stand on that and jump over the barbed wire outside, and then it was finished. So the problem was not physically getting out of the camp, but the problem was being taken care of afterwards, so that it wouldn't be recaptured, which would have been undoubtedly very unpleasant.
Right. And so being taken care of afterward actually amounted to joining a Chinese nationalist guerrilla unit and fighting the Japanese through Shandong province. This, when you were teaching and studying in China earlier. Tell us about that. What they asked you to sign up, or this was just the best way to have protection?
Well, they considered the guerrilla leadership considered my friend and I to be basically liaison with the Free China. And one of the first things we did was to look around the place, examine the guerrilla unit, and write a report, which we laboriously typed up. We brought a typewriter with us.
Out of the camp?
Out of the camp, one of those very small portables. And we figured out a way to type it onto silk, sewing the silk into the clothes of 2 Chinese couriers who went all the way back to Chongqing and delivered the report, out of which we got an airdrop, got our 2 couriers back, and a lot of money and a radio and some medicines for the camp and so on. So it all worked out to that extent. Unfortunately, the radio promptly got captured by the Japanese in one of their sweeps that made life very unpleasant for a short time. And still, we were able to get messages back right up till the end.
You were with this guerrilla unit for, what, a year and a half, a year and a quarter?
A year and a bit, yes, a year and 3-4 months.
Performing these kinds of activities?
Well, they gave us military rank. We were in the headquarters unit. They kept us sort of sequestered for a month or 2 because they were afraid that the Japanese would come and try to grab us. The setting might be interesting to you. It was, you talk about guerrillas, most people think of For Whom the Bell Tolls, people running around in the forests and mountains and hiding. This was, in the China context, and most of the guerrillas were like this, in a densely populated flat plain, close to the railway, close to a large town, city called Weixian, Wei County seat, inland from the port of Qingdao. It slowly been built up by some really genuinely patriotic anti-Japanese people from a tiny enclave to an area about 10 miles by 12 miles that we controlled all the time: schools, taxes, factories, government. And they had probably about 6,000 armed men in this place. Every 2 or 3 months, the Japanese would come and would sweep through the area, trying to essentially to catch the headquarters outfit. Our job really was to avoid battle, although our units would have to make things uncomfortable for the Japanese so that they would leave. But there were so many of these areas that the Japanese couldn't stay very long. They had to go someplace else and do their sweeps elsewhere, so that life, oh, let's say 60% of the time was quite normal and peaceful.
So you were not lingering out in the jungle somewhere, bivouacking here and there.
Not at
That's
all.
the image that I
Living
get.
in village, I know. That's the image that most people have. Living in villages, getting very close to villagers. I think I learned a lot about rural China and Chinese intellectuals, because the officer corps was generally of patriotic intellectuals. The I have to say though, that most of the effective anti-Japanese guerrillas, and my outfit was one, were actually communists, not nationalists. The 8th Route Army and all that, most people have read about them, know about them, and it is true that they were, in general, much more effective. This unit was the largest and the biggest of the nationalists, of the truly patriotic nationalist groups. It was a complicated war. We fought off communist guerrillas. The communist guerrillas attacked us from time to time, and we all fought the Japanese and what we call the puppet troops, namely the Chinese who collaborated with the Japanese. It was a fascinating period for me. I was young and foolish and enjoyed it all. I really did.
How did you decide to leave, or when was the point that you left?
After VJ Day.
I see.
When Japan surrendered,
That's right. I forgot about that 2-year internment there, or however long it was.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is at the end of the war.
End of the war. So I was about a half a day late in my friend and I in liberating the internment camp. I wish we had been early, but marching at the head of column of troops, going back to my friends. Actually, the camp had been liberated by airdropped Americans from OSS, Chongqing area, just half a day before. But that was a stirring period.
Oh, must have been. Do you keep in touch with those people now?
I used to,
Yeah.
and I do from time to time.
Yeah.
The commander of the outfit is a fascinating person. He'd been a school teacher, not a military person. He wrote his memoirs. I've got them, and I've been translating them. They're called, the title is instructive. It's called 8 Years of Anti-Japanese Struggle, Kangzhan Banyan. And my period in this, my experience in this was only, as I say, 1 year and 4 months. So the real story of guerrillas, nationalists and communists, anti-Japanese guerrillas, is a long one and extremely complicated, and I intend to finish the translation and publish that sometime, but my own part in it is just a small interlude.
Yeah. Let's move on then, whisking ahead a number of decades to your ambassadorship to the PRC. That was, you were the second, I believe, ambassador to the PRC, is that
That's right.
From 1981 to 1985.
Yes.
You came at a time when U.S.-China relations were really beginning to expand and
Yes.
beginning to solidify. I mean, there had been normalization several years before that, so you were in on some of the formation years of how U.S.-China relations evolved. Tell us about what were some of the things that you remember being the high points of your tenure in that span of years?
Well, of course, in the first place, getting to be ambassador to China, where I spoke the language fluently, and where I was born, was a great surprise and a nice way to wind up a career. After that, I reached the mandatory retirement age and retired in 1985. Before that, as Assistant Secretary and as Deputy Assistant Secretary, I'd been closely involved with China policy from the Washington end, so before 1981. I arrived in the summer of '81, and we immediately had a confrontation that illustrated a complete cycle from quite good relations to strong tensions, a downturn in everything, and then back to normality. And the cycle consisted of grave suspicion on the part of the Chinese Communist government that the Reagan administration, the new Reagan administration in 1981, was drifting off in a pro-Taiwan direction, which actually candidate Reagan had announced he was going to do in the campaign of 1980. The Reagan administration made the right noises, and Assistant Secretary Al Haig was quite instrumental in keeping our policy on track so that we didn't have a real confrontation. But the Chinese Communists got word of White House plans by some people in the White House to sell very advanced weapons to Taiwan. And with one thing and another, they decided they had to test out the Reagan administration. So they tested us out by demanding that we should set a date for terminating all arms sales to Taiwan. Otherwise, they would have to lower the level of diplomatic representation. Now that is diplomatic double talk for firing ambassadors. So you can imagine that I gave this a great deal of attention. Anyway, it took 10 months. We negotiated an agreement where we did not set a date.
This is the communique on arms sales to Taiwan.
That's right, communique of August
82.
82. Our relations remained strained by a whole series of things, a defection of a young lady tennis player, a confrontation over trade problems, a constitutional problem involving a suit in our American courts where we had to explain ad nauseum to the Chinese that the executive branch cannot interfere in our courts and so on. But by May of 1983, when our Secretary of Commerce visited there, things smoothed out, and we had a good period. This it coincided with an extremely successful period of China's economic development.
Absolutely.
Where personal income was shot up enormously. China, by the way, is still, in spite of the aftermath of Tiananmen, is still the only communist country that has given a very substantially better economic life to its people in the last 11 years among the reformers.
Right. And you noticed
it.
You noticed it during these first
few
years.
You could see it coming even in my time before 1985. After 1985, things began to level off. They've done the easy reforms, and the hard ones are still to come. But TV sets everywhere in rural villages, shops full of consumer goods, things that you simply cannot see in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union.
Let's move on. You just returned. Now, you were in China and ambassador during what I would call the formative years of U.S.-China relations in this still very young relationship of U.S. relations with the PRC. And you got to see everything put into place, and you got to see the economic reforms begin, and it must have been an exciting time. I mean, it was...
it really was.
Deng Xiaoping and China going down the capitalist road. There were all kinds of excitements and misunderstandings going on. Now, you just went again, and were there for about a month, I understand, and just returned 3 or 4 weeks ago. What is your assessment of the situation there now? This is after Tiananmen Square, 10 years, almost 10 years after you were ambassador.
Well, since 1985, I've been going back 2 or 3 times a year. As you say, I was there in early May. I'd also been there last October, November. Both times after Tiananmen, and both times had intensive discussions with high-level Chinese officials as well as with Chinese friends. I think my main overall impression is one of great sorrow that the government, the top leadership, has lost the confidence of the Chinese people. And in fact, among large segments of the intellectuals and bureaucrats, quite often government officials talk extraordinarily freely about their criticisms of the premier and of other people. This is unpleasant, and it makes you wonder why the government, which must know that it is unpopular, is not doing more to bridge this gap.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. If they talk freely to you, does that necessarily mean that they talk freely to the leaders who should be hearing this?
No,
Not at all.
it's very dangerous.
I would think so.
And by talking freely, I mean, of course, in private.
Right.
But the number of Chinese who are similarly disaffected with their government is so enormous that everybody knows who they are and they trust each other to a remarkable degree and talk to each other, of course, much even more candidly than they do to me. I had time only for a small sample, but I rely on, when I talk about generalizations like this about Chinese intellectuals, I'm relying on other Chinese who talk about intellectuals, on American newsmen, on embassy contacts. Also, we've all had the same experience of a government that's lost the confidence of its own people.
And it's so sad because things looked so bright at the beginning of the decade, the last decade, and things have now almost completely reversed, where the brightness is in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, and China looks like it's bringing up the rear. In your talks, did you speak with Chinese leaders, with the Premier? And
no, I didn't even ask to speak to the Premier, but I spoke to other high government officials. Last fall, I spoke to one of the six-man Politburo Standing Committee, Li Ruihuan, who is rumored to be the many people hope that he will be the replacement for Li Peng when Li Peng is moved out.
And was there speculation on when that would be?
Many people thought it would be done last fall, and one can speculate that maybe the example of Romania and Ceausescu, where the leaders were murdered or were executed, brought things up short and caused that not to take place. But I am confident that before long, and I'm reflecting the same kind of confidence that many Chinese expressed, that the government is going to have to take steps for the good of China, for the good of everybody, to bridge this gap. This means modest steps in the direction of democracy. The economic issues that galvanized so many people before have, if not disappeared, well, the inflation is no longer an issue. Inflation was very serious for 2 years before Tiananmen, and that's one of the factors that brought everybody out on the streets to be sympathetic with the students. Corruption is another one, and they're making efforts to attack corruption too. So the subsidiary issues don't exist, and the economy is doing well enough, and has started to grow again, doing well enough so that there's not going to be an economic collapse that will bring people out again the same way.
Right, and many people thought there might be with the retrenchment.
The Western press, I'm afraid, has concentrated on.
Oh, and people who read the Western press.
I guess I'm speaking about the American readers who were told factual things like the amount of American investment, foreign investment in China is very, very small after June of last year in Tiananmen. And you see
mean additional investment or just
that's additional investment. Very little I know of no American operation that's actually been closed down after Tiananmen. And we have substantial investments in joint ventures. It's not easy to have a joint venture in China. It's not easy in India or Indonesia either.
Right.
But we have them. But to concentrate on the amount of investment is one thing. It's trade that really drives the relationship, and our bilateral trade with China, bilateral with the United States, went up 25% last year in 1989.
That's right. And I have heard that. You're not the first person to say that and to point that out, but it seems so surprising that trade is
China's
booming.
overall exports to the world, China's overall exports rose something like 25% last year, in spite of Tiananmen, to 58 billion. So if they earn 58 billion in the U.S. dollar, equivalent of U.S. dollar 58 billion in foreign exchange, they lose 2 to 3 billion in tourism. Tourism's way down. They lose 3 or 4 billion maybe in investments that don't occur. But this is not a crippling thing, and the World Bank will say that, which knows more than anyone else about the economy, the World Bank points out that that they are still a good credit risk, and their debt service ratio is very low, and their foreign exchange position is good.
Mm-hmm. Very quickly now, we have 1 minute left, and this is a terrible position to put you in, but the succession question. When Deng Xiaoping and some of the elder leaders die, what do you see as the immediate term for China in the year after that happens?
I don't know. It's almost impossible to guess.
Okay.
Surely there will be a reshuffle of people. There will be a reevaluation of policy, which will drive personnel changes. In the scenario that many Chinese have, who are thinking not of revolution, but of evolution, Chinese in China, this scenario, Deng Xiaoping is a good guy because he may accomplish the removal of Li Peng,
Right.
the hardliner, and putting in someone who will begin to bridge this gap. So,
But nobody really knows,
the older people, when they go, and they might go close together, will set off an unpredictable situation at the top. I do not think China's going to fall into fragments because I think everyone's afraid of chaos in China, but we'll have to see.
With that prediction, I want to thank you, Ambassador Hummel, for being with us. I want to thank our audience and wish you good night.